I was meditating, and was meditating on this thing of the opening of the spiritual eyes, which might be said more accurately to say it's opening to the spiritual eyes. Because as you fully come aware or awake to who you are spiritually, let's say as a soul, one of the things that will come to you so clearly is that who you are is always awake. Who you are always sees. But you're not always in touch with that. You're, in a sense, in the amnesia that falls over our consciousnesses when we take on the body and enter this world. And so I was looking at that, and I was looking at, well, what would help people to be more conscious of what they are seeing spiritually? And I was asking that question, and the answer I heard first of all is, well, ask yourself, what is God watching right now? Because if your soul is an individuation of God, which that's my experience, then the more we are seeing as God sees, we are seeing what is. It's really just saying we're being aware of what's going on. That there's a witnessing of God, from God, for God's purposes of learning and growing and knowing, that is always present. And if we're not present with it, it's because we've shifted our focus into looking at the world through the illusion and the story of this world. And so as we do this class, and any future classes, that's one thing you could ask yourself through the process of the day. Like, what is God watching right now? And then, in a sense, accepting that in your very truth you are also God. Then you're watching it too. And this is where we get more to the true spiritual seeing. Because true spiritual seeing comes more as a knowing. It's just you just know. In a sense you're seeing it, but it's not through the eyes, and it's in a sense a image you make of what's going on. There can be a multidimensional, multifaceted way of knowing and seeing a thing. It'd be like seeing it from 10 angles at once. But it's not all the angles, it's what you know about it. So different about, say, spiritual than we'll call it psychic sight. I've expressed my point of view that the levels of what we call intuition and the ability to be psychic is saying that we are utilizing our soul's sensing capacity that it has in the different created dimensions, which would be the psychic realms, meaning they have a magnetic quality to them, and they deal in karma and time and space. And so this then is the dimension of existence where conditionality is present. And as the soul, since we have extended ourselves into the psychic magnetic worlds, even into this physical one, to have a presence here, to fulfill a purpose with this, purpose of also witnessing through this and learning through this experience of pretending we're this body and pretending the story we have about us is real. Since we're doing that, then we are engaged psychically. These would be the psychic realms, even if we're not necessarily going, well, I'm just looking and seeing. We're using the sensing capacities Through the body, we have the senses that we relate to. And then through the energy bodies, sometimes called the astral body, the causal body, the mental body, the etheric double, those things. There's also a way the soul can sense through that. The disadvantage of all that, as long as you're sensing through that, you're sensing through conditionality, and there will always be distortion. And the distortion is not always so much that you will see it unclearly, is that the distortion is that you will very likely or very possibly interpret it unclearly. Meaning you may see it, but you just really misinterpret what it means. There was a guy many years ago, I was probably going back 35, 40 years ago, on the East Coast, and I would guess now he's gone, dead, he was a very gifted clairvoyant seer, and it was interesting because many people would go to see him, and he would tell them about something, and then they would go see John Roger, my teacher to a lot of people in here, who had spiritual sight, not just clairvoyant sight. Spiritual sight, meaning he could see it as the Spirit saw it. And it was related to me, something that John Rogers said when people came in and referenced the information they got from this person related to something that person saw about them or a past life or something going on in their life. And John Rogers' comment was, it's so interesting with him. He said, he sees it so clearly, but almost inevitably, he misinterprets what it means and what you're to do about it. Because he was doing it psychically, that left his own personal identity, his own personal point of view, his own personal value system, his own personal dynamic as the interpreter of what was seen. Whereas when somebody like John Rogers saw it spiritually, there was no interpretation from, because in the seeing of it, the knowing of what it meant is part of the seeing of it, which is the great value of spiritual sight. As you see it, you know what to do with it. Because it's not like seeing it like you're looking at a record, like the Akashic record. And so you're like you're thumbing through film and going, oh, I see this. Now, what does that mean? When you're looking at it spiritually, you're not seeing it like reading a record. You're in it, and you're in it. You understand it as the soul of that person understands it, and so you not only get the view of what happened, like watching film, but there's a knowing of the deeper reality in it, the deeper direction of where to go with it, but most importantly, the deeper lesson of it. Because if the Spirit shows it to you, it will always be about your learning and growth, and it will show you within it what the soul was trying to learn from it, because the reason it would be seen spiritually, because the Spirit would see a value in your growth, value in the soul's fulfillment in this being shown and talked about. If we were looking at it psychically, we might see something that is not necessarily relevant to the soul's purpose and growth. If you think of it, if I'm looking at somebody's existence, and let's say you're looking at just this life, let alone going into past lives. Let's say the person's 60 years old. To really see everything in that 60 years, it might take me 60 years. Because it took them 60 years to play it out in time. So then, what in those 60 years is important? What is key and significant? Well, if it's left up to me and my personal value judgment, called I go in looking, like, oh, I'm looking at these records. Well, what is the key thing for that soul? What is the key learning here? Personally, I may really misinterpret that and miss that. Because I might think, oh, that's the key thing there. Because, see, that's dramatic, that event that happened. And yet, from the soulic perspective, that may not be that significant. For example, let's say you were looking at the Akashic record of somebody, and you started to look through, even if you're just looking back in this lifetime, say, oh, I see this thing happened to you when you were small, and in my mind I go, and that's really terrible because you were abused. So I feel the important thing for me to do is tell you about how you were abused there. So you take that information, and maybe you'd suppress that information, so now it's more active for you, and you get to work with it, you get to feel it, and maybe that helps you have a release. But the spirit, the soul might say, that thing that happened to you was really a balance for something you'd done some other time, and when you went through that, that completed it. And so for your growth, there's really not a reason to go back into that, because that was you were reaping what you sowed, and that balance, and it's done. So if in my human valuation of it, I go, oh, that's significant. Significant to who? Significant according to my value judgment. Maybe I was abused and I think it's significant, or maybe I just think, well, anytime anybody's mistreated, that has to be a key reason, a key thing that they need to know about. And sometimes people will go into something like that and get that revealed by somebody, and then it'll be the next 3 years of therapy, they're banging at that thing trying to get the value. But in the end, it's like, it's beating the dead horse. If anything, you going back in there is just stirring up something you didn't need to deal with. So this becomes a great limitation of seeing psychically. It's not that there can't be real value in it. It's just it's a little more hit and miss. And the more we're dealing with the deeper spiritual purposes of our life, the more likely it is to take information and, let's say, spin it in a way that is actually not producing the greatest value. So we want to, as much as we can, to see things spiritually, which means to see it directly. So if I was seeing spiritually, let's say, looking directly from the soul, without looking from the soul in the soul realm, or the realm of existence, that we could say is the soul's base of operations, I'm not needing to look through the sensing capacities the soul has on the different levels. I'm sensing it as the soul sees it. In a sense, you could say, if you wanted to use the description of it like a top-down model, well, I'm looking down from above and I can see it. This then becomes a clearer way of seeing or knowing it. And embedded within the seeing of it is a wisdom of what to do with it. It's just there. One of the ways you know you're in the wisdom of what's there is if you start to go down a direction of description or conversation that is not in line with the way it is known from the Spirit, you will lose that vision of the Spirit. And you'll feel that it's almost like you will experience like the Spirit back off. And so you realize, oh, I'm starting to press it that way, and the Spirit's not supporting that. Sit back with the Spirit. All of a sudden the Spirit goes, and you go, oh, that's the way the Spirit says it would be the highest good to relate to this. And so it requires us a greater surrender, first of all, to one's soul, to the Spirit. First, to be able to free oneself from our own story about us and us being the one doing it, so that we can let that clarity of the Spirit come through. And then to stay in the attentiveness to the Spirit in the moment. There's somebody I know who's really clairvoyant, very gifted at working with people. And when they work, it's an interesting thing. They'll get that spiritual hit, like, oh, and they start to go down a road, and all of a sudden you can see metaphysically, like a higher mind kicks in. And what they're doing then is they've got that spiritual hit of and then this other thing comes in and then starts to tell the story of this and how it happened and what it means. And that other part that's coming in doesn't have the same clarity. Now, why does that happen? That happens because there's a thing that we're all going to be subject to as something that will test us and challenge us. And this is called forced coherence, where something within us personally demands that, or insists that it all makes sense, that it can all relate in a certain way that ties things together. And this person I'm thinking of would then take this thing and then would explain all these different things. And this is why, 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 basically explaining all the problems in that person's life from that one thing, which is not possible, but improbable, certainly. But it's almost like the mind demanding that it all makes sense. And yet, many times when you get that witnessing of Spirit that comes forward, you at that moment of getting it will see no clear relationship or relevance to that person and to the situations of your life. And you may be guided to go down a direction that, as far as you know, means zero to that person. And that's kind of the great leap of faith called, this seems really incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. But this is what I'm getting. And it's at that moment where the great test is passed or failed, do we surrender to that, free ourselves from the demand that it has to make sense, and just go with what's there.